will be seeking to hold David to answer for 3 felony counts of which he has been charged. First-degree murder with special circumstances, the count of lewd and lascivious acts with a 13-year-old, and the count of mutilation of human remains.
He had 2 million monthly listeners, a debut album about to drop, a sold-out tour on the calendar, and according to Los Angeles prosecutors, in the same stretch of days that his career was taking off, he was allegedly ordering chainsaws, a body bag, and an inflatable pool to a Hollywood Hills home. This week, for the first time since a decomposing body was found inside his Tesla last September, a courtroom finally saw the evidence. Graphic photos, detective testimony, text messages, purchase receipts, a whistleblower email that was sent and ignored over a year before her death, and a 14-year-old girl's parents, sitting feet away from the man accused of killing their daughter, being told to look away from the screen. This is the preliminary hearing that will decide whether singer D4VD, real name David Anthony Burke, stands trial for murder. Here's everything that's been presented so far, the full timeline nobody has laid out in one place, and what happens next. Before this becomes a story about a courtroom, it has to be a story about a person. Celeste Rivas Hernandez was a teenager from Lake Elsinore, California, a working-class city in Riverside County, about an hour and a half southeast of Los Angeles. Family and neighbors describe a girl who struggled at times and had run away from home before her death became national news, but who was, above all, someone's daughter. When a GoFundMe was set up for her funeral costs, loved ones remembered her simply as a devoted daughter, sister, cousin, and friend. That runaway framing matters, and it's worth pausing on, because a lot of the early coverage of this case leaned on it in ways that started to feel less like context and more like an excuse. A missing 13-year-old is still a missing child, no matter how many times she left home. Riverside County records show Celeste was reported missing at least 3 separate times in 2024 alone, in January, again through February and March, and again in the fall, each time triggering deputy follow-ups at her family's home. According to a family friend, the first of those disappearances began on Valentine's Day 2024, when home security cameras reportedly caught her leaving the house around 2 in the morning after leaving a letter behind. Her family called it in that same morning. She came home each time, until April 2025, when she didn't. Her family has largely stayed out of the media spotlight throughout the investigation, a choice that reflects the trauma of losing a child in violent, public circumstances, not a lack of interest in the case. That changed, out of necessity, this week, when Celeste's mother and father sat in a downtown Los Angeles courtroom and watched, in real time, as prosecutors laid out how their daughter's body was found. In the days after her remains were identified last September, a makeshift memorial went up near her family's home in Lake Elsinore. Flowers, candles, and stuffed animals left by neighbors and classmates. Community members in the area held vigils in her memory in the weeks that followed, describing her as a well-known presence in the neighborhood despite everything she'd been through in the year before her death. Her funeral was held in early October, and her family asked for privacy in the months that followed, while the investigation into who was responsible continued largely out of public view. We're going to say her name throughout this video, because in cases like this it becomes very easy for the accused, especially when he's a public figure with an existing fanbase, to dominate the narrative. Celeste Rivas Hernandez was not a plot point in someone else's downfall. She was a girl who should still be alive. David Anthony Burke, performing as D4VD, built a fast and unusual career. He first gained traction posting music on SoundCloud and TikTok as a teenager himself, developing a devoted online fanbase before he'd signed to a label. His sound blended lo-fi bedroom pop with more polished alternative production, and by his late teens, he had genuine mainstream traction, festival slots, streaming numbers in the hundreds of millions, and a growing profile as one of the breakout young artists of his generation. One of his songs, Romantic Homicide, became a defining hit, a title that, in hindsight, a lot of true crime commentary online hasn't been able to resist pointing out. By 2025, Burke was 20 years old, preparing to release his debut studio album, and building toward a headlining tour. On the surface, it was the story of a young artist's career finally catching up to his internet following. Behind that story, according to prosecutors, was a very different one. A sexual relationship with a middle schooler that allegedly began when she was 13 and he was 18, one that Burke is accused of trying to keep hidden as his public profile grew. Burke has pleaded not guilty to every charge against him. His defense team has publicly denied the allegations. As of this hearing, no jury has heard this case, and no judge has ruled on guilt. What follows is what prosecutors say happened, not a verdict. This is the part of the timeline that has drawn the most scrutiny since charges were filed, because it stretches back much further than most people following this case realized. According to the document prosecutors used to support the charges, Burke and Celeste first met in 2022, when she was 11 years old. Prosecutors allege that in November 2023, when Burke was 18 and Celeste was 13, the two began a sexual relationship. That same month, according to public record, Burke appeared on a national late-night show to perform his breakout single. At the same time, prosecutors say the relationship with a 13-year-old had just begun. In January 2024, the two appeared together on a live stream, visible to the public, joking and talking with each other into the early hours of the morning. Weeks later, in mid-February 2024, Celeste was reported missing for the first time, at 13 years old. Missing person flyers from that period list her last known sighting as on or around February 14th. Here's where the case gets uncomfortable in a different way. On February 17th, 2024, Riverside County Sheriff's deputies identified Burke's phone number in Celeste's phone records and contacted him directly. Burke reportedly told deputies he'd last spoken to her a few days earlier and claimed he hadn't known she was a minor or that she'd been reported missing. That same night, LA County Sheriff's deputies went to the Hollywood Hills home Burke was renting for a welfare check and told him directly that the missing girl was 13 years old. 2 days after that welfare check, Celeste returned home to her family. Separately, and this detail didn't become public until well after Burke's arrest, someone concerned about Celeste's well-being had sent an email during this same window to an address bearing Burke's name on his record label's own domain, referencing rumors that he might know something about her disappearance and asking, in short, that if there was any truth to it, he'd do the right thing and get her home to her worried parents. That email has since been authenticated by the news outlet that obtained it. Celeste came home within days of it being sent. Prosecutors allege the relationship continued after that. According to charging documents, Celeste traveled with Burke to Las Vegas, London, and Texas over the following months, and even met his family. The two are alleged to have split in November 2024, when Celeste had just turned 14, and she returned to her family's home in Lake Elsinore. That's not the end of the missing persons pattern, though. Riverside County records show Celeste was reported missing again in 2024 after that. Deputies were called out multiple times that spring, with follow-up visits logged through April. She kept coming home. Then, on April 23, 2025, according to the criminal complaint, she was picked up by a rideshare and brought to Burke's Hollywood Hills home. Prosecutors say that's the last confirmed contact from her devices, and the day they allege she was killed. Pulling all of this together, here's the sequence of dates that has emerged through charging documents, hearing testimony, and reporting so far. Some of this is confirmed by court filings and public record. Some is alleged by prosecutors and has not been tested by a jury. 2022, prosecutors allege Burke and Celeste first met when she was 11. November 2023, prosecutors allege a sexual relationship began when Burke was 18 and Celeste was 13. February 14th to 17th, 2024, Celeste is reported missing for the first time. Deputies identify Burke's number in her phone records, contact him, and separately conduct a welfare check at his home, informing him she is a 13-year-old runaway. A concerned party emails Burke's label. Celeste returns home 2 days after the welfare check. Spring 2024, Celeste is reported missing again, multiple times, with deputies logging follow-up visits through April. November 2024, prosecutors allege the relationship ended around Celeste's 14th birthday. April 23, 2025, prosecutors allege this is the date Celeste was killed after being brought to Burke's Hollywood Hills home by rideshare. It's described as the last confirmed activity from her devices. April 24, 2025, prosecutors allege Burke ordered a shovel through a delivery app. April 25, 2025, Burke's debut album was released on schedule, 2 days after the date prosecutors say Celeste was killed. Early May 2025, prosecutors alleged that, using an alias, Burke acquired chainsaws, a body bag, and an inflatable pool. July 7, 2025, prosecutors allege a burn cage was ordered. September 8, 2025, a day after what would have been Celeste's 15th birthday, a Tesla registered to Burke, which had been parked and abandoned on a Hollywood street for about a month before being towed to an impound lot 2 days earlier, was opened after tow yard staff reported a foul odor and flies. Investigators found decomposing human remains inside, according to court filings separated into 2 bags, the head and torso in one, the arms and legs in another. September 17, 2025, investigators executed a search warrant at a Hollywood Hills residence tied to Burke and seized electronics and computers. At this point, Burke had not yet been named a suspect publicly, and his representatives said he was cooperating with the investigation. He canceled his remaining U.S. tour dates around this time. Late September 2025, the Los Angeles County Medical Examiner identified the remains as Celeste Rivas Hernandez. Her body was released to her family on September 23 for services. Her funeral followed in early October. April 17, 2026, Burke was arrested on suspicion of murder. April 20, 2026, Los Angeles County District Attorney Nathan Hochman announced formal charges at a press conference, laying out the alleged timeline publicly for the first time. April 29, 2026, a hearing revealed additional graphic dismemberment details for the first time. May and June 2026, multiple scheduled hearings were postponed, largely to give the defense time to review the volume of digital and physical evidence being turned over. July 21 to 22, 2026, the full multi-day preliminary hearing began, with prosecutors calling their first witnesses and presenting evidence to the court. That's over 3 years from the date prosecutors say Burke and Celeste first met, to the week a judge is now deciding whether he stands trial for her murder, and 14 months from her death to his arrest. Burke faces 3 felony counts. First-degree murder with special circumstances. The special circumstances language matters. It's what makes this a potential death penalty case. Prosecutors are alleging the murder was committed for financial gain, to silence a witness, and by lying in wait. Continuous sexual abuse of a child under 14, reported in some filings as lewd and lascivious acts with a minor, depending on the specific count language used. Unlawful mutilation of human remains. The special circumstance allegations are the reason this case could carry a death penalty designation. District Attorney Hochman has said his office will wait to see how the preliminary hearing plays out and whether the case proceeds to trial before making a final decision on whether to formally seek death. Burke has been held without bail since his arrest. Tuesday's session was the first time, in over a year of secrecy around this case, that the public got a real look at what prosecutors say they have. It did not start gently. Before testimony even began, Burke's defense team asked the judge to let him appear in court without physical restraints. The judge, Charlene Olmedo, who was presiding over the hearing, denied that request. Burke appeared in an orange jumpsuit, shackled at the waist, for the start of testimony. Celeste's parents were seated in the courtroom gallery. The DA's office called its first witness, a senior deputy from the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, who described responding to a welfare check at Burke's Hollywood Hills home. From there, prosecutors moved into what will likely be the most difficult part of this entire case to sit through: graphic crime scene photographs of Celeste's remains, shown without advance warning to the courtroom gallery. Reporters present described audible gasps in the room. Celeste's parents had reportedly been advised in advance to look away when the images appeared on screen. A homicide detective testified about the alleged trail of online purchases in the days following Celeste's death: the body bag, the chainsaws, the inflatable pool investigators believe was used to contain blood during the alleged dismemberment, and the shovel. Prosecutors are using that purchase history to build a timeline that, in their telling, shows premeditation and consciousness of guilt in the days immediately after the killing, not just the killing itself. The DA's office has been clear that a preliminary hearing does not require them to show everything. The legal standard here is probable cause, a much lower bar than guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. which is what would be required at an actual trial. Prosecutors only need to convince a judge there's enough evidence that a crime occurred and that Burke is the person who committed it, in order for the case to move forward to trial. Hochman's office has said publicly that they intend to hold back some of their case for trial itself. Wednesday's session shifted toward the digital evidence prosecutors say ties Burke to both the relationship and the alleged motive. Court filings reference text messages between Burke and Celeste that prosecutors say include discussion of sex, a pregnancy, and use of emergency contraception. Prosecutors say this messaging history is central to establishing both the nature of the relationship and Celeste's alleged threats to expose it, which the DA's office argues is the motive for the killing, tied directly to the timing of Burke's album release and upcoming tour. One detail from testimony has drawn particular attention. Courtroom reporting quoted a witness describing being told, in essence, that people around Burke were aware Celeste's age was in question, specifically, that people were telling him she was 13. If that testimony holds up as the case proceeds, it goes directly to the special circumstances and child sexual abuse allegations, and to prosecutors' argument that Burke knew who she was and continued the relationship anyway, a claim that lines up with the sheriff's welfare check in February 2024, where deputies say they told him her age directly. Testimony also touched on Burke's finances and earnings, an area prosecutors appear to be using to support the financial gain special circumstance, tying his growing income around the time of the album release to a motive for wanting Celeste silenced before his career took off further. The medical examiner's office has listed Celeste's official cause of death as multiple penetrating injuries caused by an object or objects, language that is now part of the public record, separate from the broader dismemberment allegations, which prosecutors say occurred after death. Prosecutors also walked the court back through the discovery itself on Wednesday, reinforcing testimony from the responding officers about the condition of the Tesla when it was opened at the impound lot, parked and untouched long enough that decomposition and smell were what ultimately drew attention to it, rather than any active search connected to Celeste's case. That detail matters to the state's broader argument. Prosecutors say the car sat abandoned in the Hollywood Hills for roughly a month before it was towed, which they've used to support the idea that Burke made no effort to recover or move the vehicle once Celeste's remains were inside it, despite it being registered in his name. The hearing was expected, as of Wednesday, to run 4 to 5 days total, according to DA Hochman, with prosecutors continuing to call witnesses through the rest of the weeks. A preliminary hearing isn't just a one-sided presentation. It's also the first real chance the defense has had to see and challenge the prosecution's evidence in open court ahead of a possible trial. Legal analysts following the case have pointed out a few threads the defense appears to be pulling on already. No direct statement from Burke. Prosecutors have not presented a confession. Their case, as of this hearing, is built entirely on circumstantial and forensic evidence, timeline, purchases, messages, and physical evidence, not an admission. No eyewitnesses. By prosecutors' own account, Burke and Celeste were the only two people at the home the day she is alleged to have died. There is no third-party witness to the killing itself. Evidence handling. Defense attorneys have signaled they intend to scrutinize how forensic evidence, including DNA testing tied to the chainsaws, was collected, processed, and whether it can be definitively tied to the crime as prosecutors are framing it. Cooperation with law enforcement. Reports indicate the defense may argue Burke's conduct with investigators during the initial welfare check contact, and the September 2025 search undercuts the state's narrative of a calculated cover-up, since he wasn't publicly named a suspect until months after the search warrant was executed. None of this means the defense has an easy path. Legal commentators covering the hearing have described the probable cause standard as a very low bar for prosecutors to clear, and have suggested it's very likely the case proceeds to trial. But a preliminary hearing is exactly where a defense team starts laying the groundwork for reasonable doubt down the line, even if they can't stop the case from advancing at this stage. Running in parallel to the preliminary hearing is a separate, less publicized track, a Los Angeles grand jury investigation that has reportedly been active for months. According to reporting, at least 2 people connected to Burke, a friend and online streamer, and the president of Burke's touring company, have already testified before that grand jury. More recently, Reports indicate Burke's own family, who live out of state in Texas, were summoned to testify and have been fighting that summons in Texas court, arguing that heavily redacted supporting documents denied them a fair chance to challenge it. It's not publicly known exactly what prosecutors are hoping to learn from Burke's family specifically. The redactions have kept that part sealed. But grand jury activity running alongside a preliminary hearing is not routine, and it suggests California prosecutors may be building toward additional charges or shoring up the existing ones, independent of what happens in this specific hearing. It's worth spending a moment on what happened to Burke's career in the space between the discovery of Celeste's remains and his arrest, because it shows how differently this case moved in the court of public opinion versus the actual courts. When the search warrant was executed at Burke's home in September 2025, he had not been named a suspect, and his team publicly described him as cooperating with investigators. He canceled his remaining U.S. tour dates anyway, as scrutiny mounted. Streaming numbers, radio play, and brand associations connected to him took a visible hit in the following months as more reporting connected him to Celeste's disappearance history, even before any charges existed. By the time formal charges were announced in April 2026, most of the industry relationships that had powered his rapid rise had already gone quiet. That gap, nearly a full year between the discovery of a body in his car and his arrest, has been one of the more scrutinized parts of this case in its own right, with the DA's office facing public questions about why charges took as long as they did to file, and why the case proceeded as an arrest and complaint rather than a grand jury indictment from the outset. Because so much of the discussion around this case online has confused hearing with trial, it's worth taking a minute to actually explain the mechanics, especially since it changes how you should read everything you're seeing reported this week. A preliminary hearing exists for one purpose: to let a judge, not a jury, decide whether the state has enough evidence to justify putting someone through a full trial. It's sometimes described as a mini-trial because it does involve live witnesses, cross-examination, and evidence, but the standard being applied is dramatically lower than what a trial requires. At trial, a jury has to find guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. At a preliminary hearing, a judge only has to find probable cause. Essentially, is it more likely than not that a crime occurred and that this specific person committed it? Legal analysts have repeatedly called this one of the easiest standards in the entire criminal justice system for a prosecutor to meet. That's why, even though this week's testimony has been genuinely disturbing, chainsaws, inflatable pools, graphic photographs, a body found in 2 bags, none of it is being weighed the way trial evidence eventually will be. The defense doesn't need to disprove any of it right now. They just need to show, if they can, that what's being presented doesn't rise to probable cause, which multiple attorneys following the case have said is very unlikely to happen here. There's also a separate track worth understanding: the grand jury we mentioned earlier. In California, prosecutors can pursue felony charges either through a preliminary hearing, which is public, adversarial, and lets the defense challenge evidence in real time, or through a grand jury indictment, which is secret, one-sided, and doesn't give the defense a chance to respond before charges are filed. The DA's office chose the preliminary hearing route for the murder charges against Burke himself, which is part of why we're able to sit here right now and walk you through actual courtroom testimony. The parallel grand jury activity involving people connected to Burke is a separate process, likely aimed at either additional charges or additional witnesses, and it's proceeding entirely out of public view. Understanding that distinction matters because it explains why some parts of this case, Burke's own charges, are playing out in a courtroom you can read about day by day, while other parts, what his family or his business associates may have told a grand jury, may never become public at all unless and until charges result from them. Every case involving a public figure develops its own online ecosystem, and this one developed one of the more contentious ones true crime commentary has dealt with in a while. In the immediate aftermath of the September 2025 discovery, before Burke had been named a suspect, his fanbase largely rallied around him, treating the connection to the case as incidental, his car, not his crime. Public figures and streamers with large platforms weighed in as the story developed. One prominent streamer publicly described herself as shocked and disturbed by the developments, a reaction echoed across a lot of the platforms where Burke's original fanbase had been built. as more reporting connected him to Celeste's disappearance history throughout the fall of 2025 and into 2026. That early defensiveness gave way, for a large portion of his audience, to distancing. Fans publicly renouncing his music, streaming platforms, and playlist curators quietly pulling back promotion, and a broader reassessment of how his early online persona, built in large part on parasocial closeness with a very young fanbase, looked in hindsight. There's also been a smaller, louder countercurrent. People online who focused less on the allegations themselves and more on picking apart Celeste's history, her prior runaway reports, or her family circumstances, in ways that edge toward blaming a child for her own victimization. That framing shows up a lot in true crime spaces specifically, because troubled home narratives get algorithmic traction. We're not going to do that here. A missing 13-year-old is not a cautionary tale about her own choices. She's a missing child, full stop, and the adults around her, including, prosecutors allege, the adults she was allegedly in a relationship with, carry the responsibility that a child legally cannot. This case has been unusual from the very beginning in how much public attention it drew before charges even existed. When Burke's Tesla was towed and remains were found inside it back in September 2025, his name was already trending. By the end of that year, Google's year-end data named him the most searched musician of 2025, driven almost entirely by the death investigation rather than his music. Search interest spiked again sharply around his arrest in April, and it's spiking again right now, this week, as the preliminary hearing plays out. That pattern, a public figure's search traffic climbing because of a criminal case, not despite it, is exactly the dynamic true crime coverage has to be careful not to feed into. There's a difference between covering the facts of a case responsibly and turning an accused killer into a bigger celebrity than he already was. We're not here to platform him. We're here because a girl is dead, and the public record deserves an accurate, careful accounting. What's actually trending around this case right now, based on the last few days of coverage? People searching for hearing updates day by day, questions about whether this becomes a death penalty case, confusion, and some misinformation around Celeste's exact age at different points in the relationship, renewed attention on the 2024 missing person reports, and whether more could have been done at the time, and a lot of commentary specifically urging people not to treat allegations as proven fact before a trial happens. That last instinct, the pushback against rushing to judgment, is worth encouraging in the comments below, even in a case with evidence this disturbing. Because that phrase is going to keep showing up in headlines about this case, it's worth being precise about what it does and doesn't mean in California in 2026. Yes, capital murder with special circumstances is still on the books, and yes, prosecutors can still formally seek a death sentence. That decision, as we mentioned, is still pending and will come after this hearing. But California hasn't actually executed anyone since January 2006. In March 2019, Governor Gavin Newsom signed an executive order placing a moratorium on all executions statewide, and at the same time ordered the state's execution chamber at San Quentin dismantled. That moratorium is still in effect as of this year. It doesn't erase the law. Juries can still be asked to hand down a death sentence, and hundreds of people already sentenced to death are still sitting on what used to be called death row, now dispersed across the state's prison system. But no execution can actually be carried out while the moratorium stands. That could change with a future governor, but reversing it wouldn't be simple. The state would need to rebuild an entire legally compliant execution protocol from scratch. So practically speaking, if the DA's office does decide to formally pursue death in this case, and if Burke were ultimately convicted and sentenced to death at the end of a trial that could still be a year or more away, the realistic outcome under current state policy would be a death sentence that isn't actually carried out, joining the roughly 600 other people in California currently in that same position. That context doesn't make the special circumstance allegations any less serious from a legal standpoint, but it's an important piece of the picture that a lot of coverage leaves out. The preliminary hearing is expected to run through the rest of this week. DA Hochman has estimated 4 to 5 days total. At the end of it, Judge Olmedo will rule on one question only. Is there enough evidence, probable cause, to send this case to trial? Legal analysts following the hearing have suggested that bar is very likely to be met. If the case is bound over for trial, the next major decision belongs to the DA's office. whether to formally seek the death penalty, given the special circumstance allegations already on the books. Hochman has indicated that decision will come after the preliminary hearing concludes. From there, this becomes a much longer process. Pretrial motions, additional evidence disclosure, and, eventually, if it doesn't resolve through a plea, an actual jury trial where the burden of proof rises from probable cause to beyond a reasonable doubt. That could be a long way off. Cases with special circumstance and potential death penalty exposure in Los Angeles County routinely take a year or more to reach trial after being bound over. And running quietly alongside all of it is that grand jury, which may still produce developments of its own before this ever reaches a jury box. We'll be tracking this hearing day by day, and we'll have an update the moment Judge Olmedo rules. Here's what's actually been established so far, separate from anything alleged. A 14-year-old girl is dead. Her remains were found inside a car registered to a man who has pleaded not guilty to killing her. Deputies had contact with that same man about her welfare more than a year before she died. A concerned adult tried to raise the alarm through an email that, at the time, went nowhere. A judge is now deciding, based on the evidence prosecutors have shown this week, whether he stands trial. Everything else, the relationship, the motive, the purchases, the messages, is what prosecutors say happened. It is not yet what a jury has found to be true. We're going to keep saying that throughout this case, no matter how the evidence looks, because that's the standard everyone is entitled to, including someone accused of something this disturbing. It's the same standard that protects anyone who's ever been wrongly accused of anything, and it doesn't stop applying just because a case is disturbing or high profile. What we'd also ask you to sit with, before you go, this case became a national headline because of who the accused is. But the missing person reports, the welfare checks, the pattern of a young teenager cycling in and out of contact with an adult more than twice her age, none of that started with fame, and none of it is unique to this case. It's a pattern that shows up constantly in cases involving far less famous people, and it usually gets far less attention. If anything in this timeline sounded familiar to you, a young person in your life who seems to have an adult relationship that doesn't add up, repeated disappearances that get explained away, a boyfriend who's significantly older, it's worth saying something, even if you're not sure. The email that reportedly went to Burke's label in February 2024 didn't stop what prosecutors say happened over a year later. But it's still worth being the person who sends that email or makes that call rather than staying quiet. If you want the day-by-day breakdown as this hearing continues, subscribe and turn on notifications. We'll have updates the moment there's a ruling. And if you're new here, we cover real, active cases with one rule. We separate what's proven from what's alleged every single time, even when it's tempting not to. Drop your thoughts below, respectfully, and with Celeste's family in mind. We'll see you in the next one.